Man, the song actually ended right on time and I was too busy messing with the computer to notice. All right, so the audio is working, so we're good for today. All right, so I guess it's 9:30, so we'll get this train wreck of a day going. Good to see the loyal, faithful, face-to-face crew that keeps coming back for more punishment. Good to see y'all. Those of you joining us virtually today, thank you again for joining us. Looks like my mic is picking up this time, so looks like we're good to get going. So today we're kicking off week 5 and we're starting a new module. Today we're going to start talking about the framework for U.S. urban society. And today is arguably also one of my favorite lectures because now that we're kicking off week 5, we've had a lot of time talking about lots of theory, lots of influences from around the world that have kind of shaped how we live today and why this classroom is built the way it is and why Albuquerque is structured the way it is. So now let's dive into kind of the framework for U.S. society. And so today we're taking a look at 19th century urbanization here in the U.S. Pre-standard day, announcements, opening circle, lecture, closing circle. We'll look ahead to what's due this coming Sunday. And today's activity is called Draw This World Part 1. Just some quick announcements. Thank you very much for going through the misfire of last Thursday with me. We did about 5 minutes of class here face-to-face before I realized through the chat that the audio was not working. Lance, who's watching this class and completing this class from California, thank you very much for sending that email that also got my attention. So if you watched last week's video, for the first couple of minutes, it's pretty hurried and pretty wacky, but thank you very much for letting us kickstart that back off. Also, in Learn, on the Class Learn site, the midterm section over on the left-hand side is now open, and you have a link to FatCow, and that's, again, if you want to research available URLs. And then there's a Google Doc also on there, so you can actually add to the list of suggestions. So as we mentioned last Thursday, for the midterm, you guys will actually be selecting what you want the URL link to our class blog to be. So, you know, it could be www.unmplanners.com or we've used unmgreen.com in the past. So anyway, you guys get the idea. So you can take a look, see what's available. We'll start getting a list together, and then we'll do some, what is that voting thing online? It's not Squirrel Mail, it's SurveyMonkey. I knew it had an animal in there. We'll use SurveyMonkey to put all the URLs out there so people can vote for which ones they want. Any announcements from you guys today? Nothing? All right. Those of you watching this virtually, if you have any announcements, please leave them in the chat, and other students will be able to see them there as well. And again, if you'd like me to put anything on the slide for class, send any announcement to me ahead of time as well. So for opening circle today, what things from your past do you appreciate more now that you've actually been able to put some distance from them? Those of you virtually, go ahead and use the chat to answer that question if you'd like. Certainly one thing that I'm much more appreciative of now that I've gotten away from it was growing up in a very rural community out in the middle of nowhere. I think it's one of the things that helped make me the DIY, do-it-yourself, very resourceful person I am today. Even though I'm now living in an urban environment, I think kind of having that attitude has really served me well living in this type of environment. How about you guys? Anything from your past that you appreciate now that maybe you didn't appreciate then? How close things were? What have you noticed now? Yeah, that's a good point. So we're really living in a very car-heavy dependent society where a lot of things are far away, and particularly here in the West, which we'll actually talk about on Thursday, there's kind of a very specific reason why everything is so spread out here compared to a lot of other places. So we'll definitely touch base on that. So hang on to that question and we'll come back around to it. So I know there's a lot of places to begin this conversation. So since we're talking about urbanization, and this is a lot less of a history class, where we're going to choose to pick is just kind of the start of the formal U.S. from the American Revolution. And so the reason that this is important is because what we're going to do is, for the next couple of slides here, we're just going to very quickly wrap up why we spent the last 5 weeks taking a look at philosophy and history. And that's because the foundations of the United States and the current way that we're currently structuring our cities really squarely lie in the ideas that arose from 17th and 18th European Enlightenment. And Enlightenment is kind of a weird term to associate with Europeans or just that part of history as well, because all cultures have become enlightened at some point where they made a huge shift, discovered the wheel, discovered agriculture, and then completely enlightened their society to move in a different direction. But again, US history, so that's why we call it that. So the ideas and practices that truly become American that we're going to take a look at for American cities really comes from ancient Greece and Rome, the Protestant Reformation, technology such as the Gutenberg's press. We are one of the countries that have had some of the fastest adaptation of technology that has really changed our cities. The French Revolution, the Iroquois Confederacy, and a bunch of other influences. So let's just kind of summarize the last few weeks so we can kind of get a good foundation of what we're talking about to begin here. And so what's really interesting about US urbanization, about US cities compared to a lot of other places, is that when we kind of kicked off our country, it was kind of during this midst of this perfect philosophical and political storm. And so if you really kind of think about it, flashing back to the 17th century, Europeans were describing coming out of the Dark Ages, this time of enlightenment, this time of that they were no longer universally governed and oppressed under one system. And so largely thanks to things like ocean voyages, now all of a sudden you have Europeans in constant contact with other civilizations, allowing for these cross-pollination of ideas. Of course, trade had created this whole new middle class that we had never had before, or Europe had never had before. Because prior to that, it was just this kind of oppressive system of the have and the have-nots. So history describes this as the relationship between the nobles and the peasants, the lords and the serfs, right? But then all of a sudden, coming out of the Dark Ages, all of a sudden people are engaged in trade and commerce like they had never seen before. And so now you give rise to this whole new middle space of the middle class. And we talked about this also, and why this is so important is that when Martin Luther, he's famous for nailing his 99 Theses to the door of a Catholic church, he kickstarted this thing called the Protestant Reformation. And basically by using technology such as the Gutenberg press, where he was able to spread his ideas far and wide and quickly, he was really responding to the oppressive nature of the Catholic Church. And so here's an image of Martin Luther, and you can see him, the Pope got cut off, but he's over here. But you can see him dressed in this kind of really down-to-earth way, whereas all the rest of the Catholic Church is really dressed in this really kind of rich garb. And so he was really going against the idea that the church had such hard control over everyone at the time and what they were allowed to think, what they were allowed to do. And so if we think of this idea about right when the US is getting ready to kick off, it was just really ripe with philosophy. And so here in the US, when we really take a look at what the founding fathers and what people may have been thinking at the time, the big kind of heavy hitters at the time were scholars and philosophers who kind of for the first time in this part of history were discussing these ideas of democracy and justice, but not just for kings and queens, just not for nobility, but this idea of individual liberties, individual equality. Now, again, we need to touch base on the fact that that is not fully true because, as we know, women were left out of the picture quite a bit. Anyone of color was left out of this conversation quite a bit, but there was that initial idea of liberty and equality at an individual level, which we had not really seen before. And so this guy becomes very important to the way US cities are formed and kind of our philosophical approach to them. This guy named Thomas Hobbes, which is this very grumpy dude up here, wrote this book called Leviathan. And basically what he argues is that people are incapable of ruling themselves because humans are naturally self-centered and in the need of an iron fist of a strong leader. So as you can see, he really wasn't so much on board with this idea of democracy and justice. He believed that people should be ruled because we're just naturally incapable of ruling ourselves. But then we have also smart people come into the picture, such as Voltaire and Rousseau. Rousseau, I can never pronounce that French word, encourages the questioning of absolute monarchs. And so these guys come into the kind of the flip side of the conversation, saying that no, people should have these abilities, and monarchy should not just be absolutely, what they say should not just absolutely be taken as law. And then we also have this other person named Montesquieu that suggests that there should be a separation. So he kind of combines these two and says that, well, we need leaders, we need rulers, but there's got to be some sort of separation of powers. And he calls them branches of government. And this, of course, would later be adopted as part of the American government, the separation of the executive and judicial branches and such. And the reason we touched on this part of history as well, when we were thinking about how Napoleon was able to spark and engage the French Revolution and really bring people together under the French flag in the boundaries of France, even though no one really spoke the same language. Only 1 in 8 people in France at the time actually spoke French. But what's really important is that at the founding of this country, when we started to develop it, we were also heavily borrowing from these ideas of the French Revolution and how nationalism can unite linguistically and geographically diverse people. Because the U.S. was a big place, and so how do you manage all these people under one kind of form of rule? And so they kind of borrowed nationalism as this idea. But we should also pay attention that there was lots of indigenous influences as well that were taken from ideas such as the Iroquois Confederacy, because these were actually real life examples, whereas prior, a lot of this was revolutionary thinking, kind of the first time it was really brought heavily into Europe, whereas here in the Americas, it had actually been used for a long time and had a bit more history in there. And so this offered real life examples of citizen representation, division of powers, and the giving and relinquishing of power. And so, for example, the Iroquois Confederacy was 6 different tribes up in the Northeast region that would come together for certain things. So if one of the tribes was being threatened by an enemy, they would all come together to support each other. When they had meetings, they would have representatives of each of the tribes come together and actually make collective decisions. But then they also had this idea of division of power, where certain tribes had certain roles within the larger structure, and the relinquishing of giving of power. And so they recognized that in times of peace, when you had the ability to actually think out decisions, get together in councils, get the wisdom of the elders, they would do that. But in times of war, they would actually appoint one person in charge of everybody, i.e. we know today as the war chief. They would manage everybody quickly, and then when the threat was gone, would relinquish that power back to the role of democracy. And so we were borrowing heavily from a lot of different things going on at this time. But let's kickstart the actual conversation. So that's kind of summarizing what we've been talking about for the last few weeks. And so even though this class will certainly recognize, and we did spend quite a bit of time talking on all these different things that influenced us today, how we separated ideas of race and culture, getting away from the idea of the haves and the have-nots just through money, and kind of switching the focus to race here in this country, and a bunch of other wild things we did. This guy pretty much gets all the historical love. So if you really want to have a simple, straightforward conversation about urbanism, the United States, John Locke is a 17th century English philosopher that pretty much is where a lot of people start this conversation. And so the interesting thing about this guy is he actually agreed with Hobbes. And what Hobbes, if you remember, says is that people are incapable of ruling themselves because humans are naturally self-centered and in need of an iron fist of a strong leader. So he was actually very much on board with this thinking, but the only real difference is that he had more optimism about people's ability to use reason, logic, to actually avoid the tyranny of a ruler using an iron fist. So he recognized that we need strong leaders, we need powerful leaders, but at the same time, the people should have the ability to use reason and logic to avoid a tyranny situation. This is John Locke up here. I've always believed if they made a movie about him, Adrian Brody should be the actor. I think they look a lot alike. So what Locke says is that a ruler gains authority through the consent of the governed. the duty that the government is to protect the natural rights of the people, which he believed to include life, liberty, and property. Of course, we would change that to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So essentially what he's saying is that if the government should fail to protect these rights, that citizens should have the right to overthrow that government. And so while European history was really embracing the Enlightenment, these philosophical arguments, having huge revolutions against their leaders, we here in the U.S. kind of took both, where we said, yep, we need strong rulers who are going to rule us with an iron fist, but at the same time, if you become too tyrannical, we will overthrow you. So really wild combination. So really what we've been doing for the last few weeks is we've been kind of taking an ecological approach. And so since this class is focused on social issues in urban and regional development, we really wanted a strong foundation of our social challenges, so now we can go into urbanism. And so this idea really comes from the idea of ecology that was established in the 18th century. And it comes from a Greek couple of words, eco meaning house and logi meaning the study. And so ecology is the study of one's house. And so here in this class, we're applying that to the greater world because we're taking an urban ecology approach. And primarily the urban ecology is this idea that thanks largely to the Industrial Revolution, thanks largely to the Enlightenment and these new ideas coming part of the grander social consciousness, that for quite a while now, we are no longer living with nature. We're controlling, dominating, and manipulating nature to meet our needs now, rather than the other way. And so what we're going to be talking about here is this idea of urban ecology. So the study of our house or the study of our cities really comes from the Industrial Revolution. And what a lot of people don't really know is that there was actually two industrial revolutions. The first one was just largely confined to Britain. That's why we don't talk about it too much. And that was in about the mid-18th century. And then the mid-19th century, which we're talking about today, to the early 20th century, these other countries jump in. So now we have a combination of Britain, the rest of Europe, North America, and Japan. So let's study this then. So if we're going to study our own house, our own urbanism, let's take a look here. So at the start of the 19th century, so the 1800s, total population was about 5.3 million. And it should be absolutely recognized that there was a lot of different people that made up this number. And this was the first census we ever did in this country. And we historically know that there was about 900,000 slaves as part of this 5.3 million population. So it was a large number. Urbanized population was only 300,000 though. So that means only 6% of the total US population lived in an urban area. At this time of the 1800s, New York was only about 100,000 people. If you're wondering what you did for a job in this era, what you did for money, it was largely agricultural. So the agricultural workforce was about 85 to 90% of all employment here in the US. And 75% of the entire 5.3 million population lived within 50 miles of the East Coast. And so if we were to kind of visualize these numbers in a slightly different way, I kind of jumped there. We're really talking about this. So at the start of the 18th century, 5.3 million people living within about 50 miles of the coast. And so as you can see, these other territories and these other few states, since they're much farther than 50 miles from the coast, this is only about where 25% of the population was living at the time. So at the start of the 18th century, when we're talking about the first American cities, the rise of urbanism, it's a very small part of the country that we're talking about. But let's fast forward 100 quick years here. And so at the beginning of the 1900s, 100 years later, the total US population goes from 5.3 million, and in 100 years jumps to 76 million people. Urbanized population at the 1800s was 300,000. Now in the 1900s was 30 million. So in 100 short years, we went from 6% of the population living in the city to 40% of the population living in the city. And as we brought up from a point from last week's lecture, It was in the roaring 1920s here in the US where we crossed the threshold of 50%, where we had 53% of the total population now living in the city. New York's population went from 100,000 people to 3 million. And the agricultural workforce went from 85–90% and dropped all the way down to 50. So what this tells us as far as 19th century urbanization is that largely thanks due to the rapid urbanization of American cities, we can now see why people basically lived in tenement housing, why we were stacking people on top of each other. Because in order to meet these numbers, we had to make some pretty wild choices about the type of cities we were building at that time. And so let's take a look at these numbers and let's see how it really affected it, right? So we were talking about this image here, 5.3 million people within 75 miles of the coast. Really, this is the formal states. We can see some city populations here. This larger circle is over 1 million people. We have no larger circles. City population of 250 to 1 million. We have no medium-sized circles. So that means the only cities that we really have here at this time are 10,000 to 250,000 people. So you can see New York, Boston, DC, and this is the first census that we ever took, which was in 1800, so it really only included these states. Now, as we just talked about, within 100 short years, we went from this to this. And so at the beginning of the 1900s, US population, you can finally see some cities over 1 million starting to appear in Chicago, New York, Boston. You can see states as part of the census in the 1900s. We only have 3 states left. If you've ever wondered why Oklahoma has what's known as the Panhandle, is because during the Civil War, for Texas to be considered part of the South, they had to give up all land south of this parallel. So that's why they gave up that little sliver of land, and why Texas ends right there. It actually used to go up to the top there. And so that land went actually unassigned for 45 years after Texas gave it up. And when Oklahoma became a state, that's how they got the Panhandle. So even when we're talking about cities and where state boundaries come from and all of these natures, there's always quite a bit going into it. So how in the heck did we go from 5 million people to almost 75 million people in 100 years? Because no other country in the history of the world has had that many people hit it at one time. Certainly there's been countries that have much bigger populations, but not that kind of rapid growth. So what are we talking about here? Well, if we're talking about natural population growth, the way that we usually measure these things is what's called the rate of natural increase, which is taking the number of people being born and subtracting the number of people who have died. And so the big thing to really consider here is this is a much different world from the one we're living in today. So in 1790, each married woman averaged about 8 kids. And so, of course, this is before vaccines. This is before any real knowledge of bacteria killing us. And so it was just kind of taken that, a chunk of your kids were going to die. And so in order to outmatch that death rate, you just had a lot of kids. And then in 1790 to 1860, literally the population was doubling every 23 years. Now, while that's the natural population growth, we also had, because we were a new country, the idea of immigration, so transatlantic steamship, technology, now having the ability to even bring more people. And so at this time, with everyone coming over from Europe, the median age of European immigrants was only 16 years old. So we were a very young country, attracting lots of young people. This idea of land ownership, the idea of freedoms that we had, the idea that you could come over here, have large families, et cetera, et cetera. And so when you put all of these things together, it's one of the reasons why we had such a huge increase. But this isn't the whole story, right? And so last week, we actually discussed the ideas that even though people were moving into the country is increasing in population, people living in the actual cities were dying at a faster rate than they were being born within the city. And so literally, the only thing that really explains this idea of rapid urbanization versus total growth is because there were so many people, thanks to the things that we just talked about, having a lot of kids, immigration, that they were largely flowing into the cities and replacing the number of people who were dying. And so it looked like cities were good places to be because the population was rising, but really it was just people coming into them. And so we know this is not true because if we were to only use death versus rates, birth rates in these cities, then what would happen is we should have seen immigration, we should have seen population growth distributed evenly across rural and urban areas, but this only occurred in urban areas. And so it's kind of one of those unusual markers that tells us that cities were playing a huge role during this period. Of course, we had a lot of other things happening as well. And so the reason that the population distribution was not even is due to several things. And one is that, we had the American Civil War occurring during this time. And so when we take a look at this next map here, we'll see that cities in the South really weren't all that into urbanism. They were heavily still embroiled in this idea of cotton plantations. They were still embroiled in the ideas of the past, and they were not looking at city design. And so just to show how much of an effect this still has even today, pre-Civil War, Charleston was only the 5th largest city in the U.S., and then post-Civil War, it's only the 25th largest city. And so you can see that the South really has held on to this idea of land, not so much as urbanism. And then, of course, one of the things that drives us to go further west even more and distribute the population across the country is in 1860, gold was discovered in California. And so that took a lot of people from the east and also sent them west. And so when we're talking about the rise of cities during this time, this map also illustrates that idea that we just kind of talked about. And so you can see the tighter knit of urbanization in the upper part of the map and the less distribution in the south. And these are actually railroad lines. And so the growth of large cities is promoted by the development of low-cost transportation, i.e. the railroad and the steam engine. And so now, besides just people living within 75 miles of the coast, now we have this low-cost technology to take people west. We have this low-cost technology to bring people from the south into the north and vice versa. And so it's really hard to imagine that in the absence of this transportation network, of the design of cities, that we would actually support this idea of expansion of a system in order to reach new materials and have new agricultural opportunities out here in the breadbasket, for example, that there's a real argument that without technology, perhaps American cities would have stayed smaller for a longer period of time. Maybe we would have embraced the European model much more of people living together in tighter communities, farming the area around them, only having other smaller communities in walking distance for security. But we didn't really have that here. And so because we embraced this technology and really ran with it, it's also one of the reasons that we have the separation of urbanization at this time that we did. And so it's important to note that trains at this time, steam-powered engines, things of this nature, this really is the relationship of American urbanism, and as we'll see later on, it really becomes the relationship of Americanism with the car. But trains in American culture during this time, our embracing of technology has really become part of the conversation. And if you've ever seen this movie, it's very interesting. It's like a 30-second, 60-second short. It was L'arrivée d'un train, un grade, un Lechat of 1986, and basically the translation is the arrival of a train at Lechat, and it's a 50-cent long by the Lumiere brothers. If you've ever taken any film classes, those guys are famous. And basically what they did is they showed this in the theater. It's the train pulling into the train stop. And there's this myth that it scared so many people out of the theater, right? They just saw this big train coming at them. They freaked out and ran out of the theater. It turns out that is not true whatsoever. That was actually a myth started by newspapers at the time because they were afraid that this new medium was going to take away from their readership in the newspapers. And so you can kind of see some things here, because even now when we talk about the internet, creating this new culture of us, separating us, our conversations are no longer together. We've been having this conversation for a long time. And so some other things that occurred is that newspapers also said that people should not ride the trains, particularly women, because if the trains went faster than 20 miles per hour, you would suffocate while riding the train, and a woman's uterus would fly out of her body. So even here in this country, when we have stories like this that we go back and read, of course, taken with a grain of salt. But Albuquerque also has this too. And so it's also worth noting that when we talk about these bigger ideas, they occurred here in our town as well throughout history, right? So as another example, we have War of the Worlds, which was the radio drama. And again, this is where it was the invasion of, is that 1890? No, it should be 1890. I don't remember the date. I apologize. That's the wrong date. But anyway, his radio drama mimicked the invasion of aliens of the U.S., also kind of allegedly freaked everyone out. But here, back in Albuquerque, back in 1947, we actually had some fellow UNM students who threw a bunch of old tires into the back of a truck, drove up to the west side back here behind the volcanoes, and actually lit all the tires on fire to mimic that the volcano was erupting again. And so you can see it up there, the black smoke. And this actually kind of freaked people out. And so we actually had people in Albuquerque at the time, like getting in their vehicles and going east towards the mountains to get away from the volcano, because some believed that it was getting ready to erupt. And the funny thing is that even though it sounds kind of funny that we would do that, and this natural pranking has always kind of been part of the urban culture. If you guys didn't know, we do actually sit on top of an active lava field. The biggest one is down here in Los Lunas and Socorro. And so if you've ever seen the Facebook plant, it's literally built on top of the Los Lunas magma flow, and all of these other ones that we have. And they become active every 11,000 years. Well, guess when the last time it was active? About 11,000 years ago. But the actual last eruption with actual lava coming out of the ground is 140,000 years ago. So if you ever want to mimic this prank or make people aware of the fact that we are actually living on top of an active lava field, you can see this time and time again. And so this just supports this idea that scholars argue that even this technology today, our fears of it, how it's changing us, how these different media platforms, access to technology, et cetera, as more and more people come to live in cities, this pattern has just repeated itself several times over history. So let's now talk about kind of this shift in technology, this shift in industrial revolution, right? So when we're talking about this huge population growth, this huge rise in agricultural productivity in order to support these folks, the combination of low-cost transportation, the factories that we need to support all of these things. If we were to tell this story, it does sufficiently explain the 19th century city, but for me, it doesn't really explain the whole story, because it's not just a story of people coming into the city. It's really this embracement of technology. And so if we add in the Industrial Revolution into this whole kind of conversation here, is that machinery largely made farming more productive. So let's go back and talk about the formation of Göbekli Tepe, right? And people choosing now to settle in stone dwellings, people coming together to no longer hunt and gather, but to farm. It's really a parallel conversation to the United States at this time, because we have people leaving the workforce to seek other employment. Much of it was in cities, and the agricultural workforce went from 85–90% down to 50%. So remember when we were talking about the city of Uruk and how they used to make beautiful handmade, hand-painted pottery, and then when they engaged in a process of mass production, the pottery quality became really cheap, really poor, looked really low quality. Well, we kind of had a very similar parallel with that as well. And so here in the US, this idea of industrialization, the combination of technology really sets the framework for basically how we live today from a consumer society. And so industrialization leads to these huge factories. And so we have a shift from cottage industries, i.e. the mom and pops, and we have this massive shift over into the labor force. And so you are no longer a specialist in making shoes from start to finish. Now you just become the expert of putting the sole onto the shoe rather than actually being able to do the whole process. And so now since we have this huge shift from cottage industries, mom and pops, into factory production, for the first time here in urban areas, now we have this new mass labor force, i.e. the blue collars. So you have the people on the factory floor, the people doing the actual work. But the thing is that to manage that amount of people doing that work, you also need an equally large administrative force. And so now you get the white collar jobs. And so it's not just people coming into the city to work, but now it's also being able to manage the people who are working. And if we flash back to the conversation we had of Uruk, when they were starting to put in all of the canals and actually redirect water from the Tigris River into their communities, this was also the first kind of rise of this new idea of managing the workforce. So you fast forward to that here in the United States, and now we have the same thing happening with a large labor force and a large administrative force. And so if we're wondering how we went from only 100,000 people, or only 5% of the population, to 40% living in the city, now we also have this huge labor force, which means that we need to create this enormous housing market to meet the demand of people moving into cities. And so now you have this idea of the factory, people living close by, and then you add on the fact that they need something to do with their money. And now we have this huge demand for consumer goods. So this is really the beginning of the department store relationship, of the consumer relationship that we have today. This idea of people working, living next to where they work, and being able to use that money to buy the same goods and services that they're producing. So when you take all of these things, it really kind of leads us into this new massive labor and administrative force. So for example, if you guys are working towards a planning degree today, if you're thinking about becoming a transportation planner, if you're thinking about becoming a city planner, whatever the case may be, you are preparing to enter into a large administrative force, something that's been established in this country during the 19th century and is still kind of the basis for the job market that we have today. And what's missing is this idea of we have never had this many people living in the same area before compared to any other point in history. And so just to kind of reiterate what we were talking about last week is that as more and more and more and more people come into the cities, you have more and more people crammed into tenement housing. As we discussed, there's no running water, there's no toilet facilities, anything of that nature. And so what happens is all the open space that was originally between the buildings disappears. Buildings are built higher and higher. All the green space and open space disappears, and streets become increasingly congested, as you can see here. And so it's not just when we take a look at the 20th century city, which we'll start doing on Thursday, it's not just that we've always had this many people living in cities, is that during the 19th century, we had far more people living on top of each other than at any point we've ever had. And so this is a political cartoon commenting on this challenge of diversity, of population density and immigration that you're seeing here. So even back then, people were blaming immigration coming into this country. So it's a very old kind of political conversation. But Just to make sense of this, so at the end of the 19th century, if you take New York's Manhattan Island, which is only 22 square miles, it had a population of 2.2 million. So if you divide that by the 22 square miles, that means you had 100,000 people living per square mile. Now, if you contrast that with today, the last numbers that we have from the 2000 census, the entire population of Manhattan Island was only 1.5 million, and that's with modern skyscrapers. So remember, back then, we were only building 5 stories. Oh, I guess I don't have that slide. We were only building 5 stories tall tenement housing, brick and wood buildings. And so when you try to imagine 100,000 people, 2.2 million living in that one, divided into that 1 square mile space, versus today, the population of Manhattan with higher buildings, you can only imagine probably how awful it was. Again, no running water, nothing there. Now, the thing is that when we take a look at 20th century cities here, the reason that we're talking about this 19th century framework to kind of kickstart our conversation is because the first 5 American cities were seaports. And the reason for this is because prior to the steam engine, prior to the train, water transportation through ship was super cheap. And so cities served by both rail and water had access to land and industry for industrial and commercial. So the reason that New York, Boston, DC, all these port cities, Chicago through the Great Lakes, once we were able to get up there, reason that these cities are so large and so powerful is because they were established under one technology. When another technology came along, they were able to adopt that even further, and they were able to expand the size of the city even further. Now, the big contrast that we need to talk about between cities of this era and the way we live today when we start talking about the 20th century city on Thursday is that during this time, the absolute minimum amount of land was used for housing and residential, even though the working class was the biggest percentage of the population. And so during this time, the focus is not on the home as we have it today. And so back then, the idea of residential space, the idea of living comfortably was really at the bottom of the rung. It was the idea of work, consumerism, engaging with technologies, engaging the land, and things of this nature. And so the thing I wanted to point out here, though, is that if you take a look at this photo, and unfortunately the best one I could find is a stock photo, so it's got some stuff written on it, but this is the southwest side of Manhattan Island. And so down here is Battery Park. Here's where the Twin Towers used to stand. And so you can see back at the beginning of the 19th century, we were really heavily still using ship power as our main mode of transportation. And again, Battery Park is my favorite place where I used to buy fake Rolexes. But you can see that what they did is when they actually expanded Manhattan Island, they actually used the docks to actually push earth out into the river in order to be able to claim some more land for Manhattan Island. And while that doesn't seem like such a big deal, remember this picture that we had from a couple of weeks ago. So this idea of 18th century urbanism, the response of city design in order to meet the needs of the people, this idea that we would build out into the river. Now, this is Battery Park. This is that same space where they actually did move the earth out into the river to make more land available on the island. So even though we see images like this as this really kind of crazy idea of what we were actually thinking to do to respond to urbanism and population density at the time, suddenly this idea is not so crazy because we did do it right there. And so since we're talking about kind of these ideas, why is it that stuff like this came about during this era of the 19th century? We certainly have already introduced Woodward's city idea of Detroit. We've also introduced the idea of the Peace City. But here in the US, let's take a look at a couple of other things. And so, this is the slide I was going to hop to. the idea of 5-story tenements, the number of people living here. And so I showed this one last week, but just to illustrate that point of how people were living at that time. So if you've ever shaved or shaven, if you've ever shaved with a Gillette razor, let me introduce you to King Gillette. So King Gillette, which is famous for the Gillette razors that many of us use every single day, he was alive during this time of rapid urbanization, where the population of the US went from 5 million to 75 million. And so he was one of the people thinking about, just like that one illustration of moving land out in to make Manhattan Island bigger. He was also one of the people thinking about this. And so he actually put forth this idea in a book that he wrote for the idea of Metropolis. And so King Gillette, and his first name was King, so he wasn't an actual king, who founded Gillette razors, he actually believed and put forth this idea of the metropolis, that here in the United States, we should build this city, this giant city called Metropolis, and it should be powered by Niagara Falls. So natural, clean energy provided by the waterfalls. Metropolis could hold about 60 million people. As we've been talking about how cities were dirty places, you know, dead horses, horse manure, human excrement out in the streets, he believed that in order to solve some of these problems, we should have a bike-only city. So he did not believe horses should be allowed in the city. Steam engines should be allowed in the city. He wanted this city to be bike-only. And one of the other things he advocated was there should be no money, because this idea of capitalism and this idea of people literally killing themselves to survive was not such a great idea, which is kind of an interesting thing coming from a capitalist who basically built his empire on capitalism and razors. But again, we give people credit for different things. And so if you've ever been to Niagara Falls, here's the view from the border. So here's the border here. This is the US side. This is the Canadian side. This is actually a bunch of casinos. So if you ever want to stay in the casino and then look out into the falls at night, it's actually a really beautiful view. So this is Buffalo, New York over here. And so if you were, let's just say you were sitting on your 16th story casino hotel room looking out across, this is what you would see, Niagara Falls. And so this is the backside of it, the water falling in. This is the actual falls side. And here's his idea for Metropolis in the back. These huge circular buildings kind of rising out of the distance. And so this is a small section plan for Metropolis. And so these are the streets here dividing everything. And so these buildings here, you can see them labeled here. They're actually, I don't want to say hollow in the middle, but empty in the middle. So the building is actually designed in a circular pattern, and on the inside of the building is a green space atrium. But essentially the buildings were also separated in this very planned out way. So everything on this, where it says A is an educational building, so a college, a school, some sort of trade where you would learn a trade craft. B is your amusement buildings, so where you would do your shopping, where you would go watch a movie, go bowling, et cetera, et cetera. And then the C buildings were the food storage and the food service buildings, so the restaurants, but also the food warehouses, et cetera, et cetera. So he saw, you know, the food markets down by the docks and just how accessible the food was. And so his idea was have that food brought in and have where you get your food and everything serviceable in one spot. But his main idea was that each building use was at the center of the other uses. So just for example, if you take a C building here and you look at the other buildings around it, there's no other C building. So it became central to these other buildings. But at the same time, if you took a look at a B building, looked at the buildings around it, there's no other B buildings. And so he had it very strategically laid out. And so everything was in walking distance, everything was in biking distance. If you lived up, or if you went to school up here, there was no reason to go all the way down to this school down here. And so these were, all these unlabeled buildings are the ones that you actually lived in. And so everything was in the same distance from each other. So there was no reason for horses in the city, and everything could be by bike. And so here's King Gillette's Metropolis. And so this is the idea, and this is kind of what we call the golden age of urban design, is because we had people who were not planners, not architects, but having ideas put forth on how to address the challenges of urbanism. So even though King Gillette was a capitalist and gets credit for inventing the Gillette razor, his big concern was responding to urban density and the challenges thereof. And so this is a model of one of the buildings. And so you can see the same pattern up here. This is a drawing of it. And so what would happen is this is a cross section. And so this is the inside that I was telling you about, the big open atrium. And so you had this space here. These are hallways. And so you would take the elevator up, get off on your floor. And when you were walking to your, just like at a hotel or something, when you're walking to your living space, you would be able to see into the atrium. And then each one of these living spaces is designed like this. So here is the hallway looping around. And then you would enter into your space on your floor. And when you walked in, on each side, you would have a sitting room, a hallway that took you down to the parlor. You have 2 living rooms here, basically, 4 bedrooms, 1 bathroom for each bedroom. And then you even have a giant large bay window, and you have your own patio, your veranda out there. So you had views on the inside of the building and on the outside of the building. So just as a residential space, even though you have way more people crammed into this living space, because of the way it was designed, it feels more open. So as you can see, this is 1894, and so this would have been at the height of 19th century urbanism. So this would have been about 70 million people living in the US at the time, and so this was his response to that. But let's also bring up Ebenezer's garden cities as well. Now, Ebenezer was not American. He was actually English. But of course, London was experiencing the exact same problems that we are experiencing here in the US. And so the interesting thing about Ebenezer, just like King Gillette, is that he was actually a court stenographer, one of the guys sitting there taking the notes on the court machine. And of course, living in London, he was also exposed to the rapid urbanization, the rapid population growth, the smog, the pollution, everything out in the streets. And so this is his idea for the Garden Cities of Tomorrow, which you'll see up here. It says group of slumless, smokeless cities. And so his idea is that you would create a series of cities all connected by rail. The largest city would be here in the middle, which would have a population max of 58,000 people. These are all rail lines going out. And you have smaller cities out here of about 38,000 people, or 32,000 people, I apologize. And then all of this is dedicated green space. And so like up here, you have forests, you have large farms, reservoirs, and a waterfall. And so the waterfall is what would power a lot of this. And then these outer circles are also rail lines. If you've ever watched the anime cartoon Full Metal Alchemist, that entire kind of anime world is based on this idea of a garden city. And so you can just see this kind of close-up diagram here. And so what Ebenezer's thoughts is that within any one of these given circles, so let's just take a little cross-section here. So if this is the middle of the circle, the very middle would have a garden. On each side of the center of the city, you would have your civic services, your hospitals, your libraries, your theaters, your museums. Around that, you would have green space, your central park, and recreation space. And then the next couple of rings going out, which were called zones 3 and 4, was all residential use, with the middle zone being an open grand avenue, which was where your schools would be, because he understood that, much like King Gillette, that in order to have a slumless, smokeless city free of waste and pollution, that you needed closer travel. And so since everyone lived here, let's put the schools there. But at the same time, on the outer edge, you did want to separate the use of services you need. And so Ebenezer wasn't totally dismissing the idea of industrialization, but he was saying there's a place for it. And so on the edge is where you would have your industrial use. So here's your dairy farms, here's your boot factory, here's your furniture factory. And then on the outskirts of that is where your agricultural and large farming would occur. And so this is Ebenezer's idea of put forth in 1902, so literally only 118 years ago. And so the thing that's really interesting about this is that we actually built quite a bit of this stuff. And so I haven't shared the fact that if you go to Detroit, you can actually see real world built pieces of Woodard's plan that did actually get realized. Part of Ebenezer's Green Cities is that over in England, about 30 of these actually did start to get developed. And in the US, we even have a couple. If you've ever been to Greenbelt, Maryland, established in 35, Green Hills, Ohio, everything has green in it, and Greendale, Wisconsin in 1936 even. These things were being put forth. And so here's a cross section of one city. So here is the rail line, and you can see just the beginning of the circle starting to occur, but obviously it wasn't fully realized. Over here, you can see also the main rail line. You can start to see the sweep of the circle, and it even made it over here and then kind of gets lost. You can see that there was a one Grand Avenue actually made. So here we can see if this would have been the city center, here's where the universities, the civic space was. Here's what should have been a rail line. Here's all the residential. This would have been a school. And then over here would have been factory. And so you can see example again and again of these things just starting to take shape before they were all interrupted. And so it does beg to ask, if this is the golden age of urban design and urban planning, then what the heck happened? Why wasn't more of this stuff built? Why wasn't the Peace City actually realized? Why didn't we see more of Woodard's plan for Detroit built? Even though we didn't actually go this far into development, why did Manhattan Island do that over here? And why was King Gillette's Metropolis never built? Well, the thing that you will see, and we're going to talk about time and time and time again, is this idea of urban planning as a wicked problem. We don't really know where things start. We don't really even know when problems are officially fixed. And usually by the time we even find the problem and start to address it, something else changes and completely moves the game around on us. Any guess what stopped all of this? Cars. So here's the big shift, is that when we're talking about the 19th century in the American city, it's largely a conversation of rapid urbanization. And so when we've talked about previous lectures about how cities were so polluted, that's why. So we're kind of tying these ideas back together. And so the interesting thing is that we could have actually had garden cities built. We could have had King Gillette's Metropolis possibly established out in Buffalo. But the thing is that at the time, this was all based on the idea of horse manure, human waste out in the streets, people's inability to move based on technology. But then all of a sudden the car comes along and completely changes the story. So now we don't have to worry about horse manure anymore. We just migrate towards vehicles. And so the thing is that what's really interesting about urbanism here in the United States is that when we see this big shift that we're going to talk about on Thursday to the car-dependent society, exactly why things are so far away and why you really need a vehicle to even live in certain parts of the country or the country in general is largely because of the automobile. And the interesting thing is that this could have all changed too. So just as an example, early cars by Ford were actually electric. He was working with Thomas Edison at the time to develop the rapid technological advancement of cars, and so cars were actually electric at this time. But the reason that cars are largely gasoline powered today is because John Rockefeller, which was the oil tycoon, if you've ever seen some movies about him, he actually intentionally caused rubber and material shortages coming into the United States. And so he basically forced Ford to go to gasoline cars just to survive. And so today, when we in the past, when we've talked about why it's not so hard, or why it is so hard just to say that you can hate the current President Trump for a lot of other reasons, and yet if by putting tariffs on China allows like my home community to suddenly have mining come back and have new economic opportunities, right? Well, there's been several of those instances throughout our history, and some of it was more intentional, where you have Rockefeller actually blocking consumer materials into the United States, forcing Ford to switch to gasoline, because of course, if you are the oil tycoon making oil and gas and you see the rise of technology, you want that technology using your product. And so when we talk about 20th century urbanization, we're going to see a lot of different stories like this where it could have been so much different. And just to illustrate this point a little further, this is London in relationship to growth of the electric streetcar. So this is 1840, 1860, 1880, and 1900. So in 60 years, thanks to the streetcar, London was able to go from that size to this size. And you can kind of see all these outlying communities really kind of starting to crop up. But then when the automobile gets largely introduced, this is 1914 and 1929. So this is only 30 short years compared to 60, and you can see the huge explosion of population density. And so that's really going to set the stage for Thursday when we talk about urbanization of the 20th century. So for closing circle today, so the story of 19th century American city, it was largely a response due to rapid urbanization and the wicked problems that came with it. As we're going to go back and forth on, we're going to see certain things that occurred in the 19th century and how they still impact the way that we live today. And so looking back, the thing is that we can certainly appreciate industrialization. We can appreciate how we can go on Amazon and get something delivered to us same day or 2 days. But the thing is that for our current urban society to be structured off that way, we really need to go back and kind of take a look at these things. And so, just like we pointed out with the car and how Ford was forced to go from electric to gas, hindsight is 2020. And so even though we go back and we mention European enlightenment, it's not really the whole story, but it does give us the ability to set the stage. So why not do things better today with what we have now? And so that's kind of really the interesting thing when we start to take a look at the cities of today and compare it to what we were really thinking the city of the future was going to be right up until COVID occurred. And all of a sudden, we were shown that large social movements of people really can change the world. And so we'll talk about that here in the coming times. So any questions about 19th century urbanism here in the United States? No worries. If you have any questions, email them to me later, of course. Those of you watching the class virtually, if you'd like to leave any questions in the chat, please feel free to do so. All right, so let's look ahead. So coming up this week, we have a selection of readings. We have peer review number 2. I just wanted to take a moment and say excellent job with reflection synthesis number 2. I saw a lot of improvements. Again, I haven't graded those yet because I wait until the peer reviews because it's a two-part assignment. And so I have checked a lot of those out and started to leave feedback, but you haven't seen that yet. Upcoming this Sunday, aside from the peer reviews, is your idea journal, number 3. And you also have the 60-second video introduction. And so, as you guys know, rather than just giving you a midterm, giving you an exam, giving you something that's due on midterm day. We're actually building a more comprehensive experience by distributively organizing these practices throughout the first half of the semester. And so one of the aspects that we're doing in this is the 60-second video introduction. And so let me just jump on Learn real quick to show you what that looks like. And so in Learn, if you jump down to week 5, you'll see that in the watch section, for below Thursday's class, I have now added some resource videos. And so the first resource video is just a really great video that shows you how to organize and give a 60-second self-introduction. And then we have resource videos B, C, and D, which is actual real-life examples of UNM students introducing themselves in 60 seconds. And so besides watching the video showing you how to organize your 60-second video and what to say about yourself, you have examples of real people doing just that, your fellow UNM peers. And so as you watch these videos and you're starting to outline what it is you want to say, when you watch these videos, ask yourself, what parts of the video can I use for my own introduction? Maybe one of the UNM students introduced themselves in a way that you really liked, and you would like to mimic that structure. Which parts were okay but could be improved upon? Which parts would you like to avoid in your own video, right? So as you watch these 3 examples, you kind of have the ability to be like, ooh, I don't like what they said there. Let's not make that part of mine, right? So by doing this, you have the ability to actually structure your own 60-second video with professional advice and real-life examples. And so these videos, you can just record them on your cell phone. You can record them on your laptop using Zoom, for example, or any other video chat service that you have that you would like to record. And then if you come down here, you can see that there's a place to submit those, and you just upload them. The other thing you can do too is, since we will eventually be using these for our midterm blog pages, if you want, you can also upload your video to your own YouTube account, make the video unlisted so that way nobody can find it if they're searching, and then just upload the link to the video in your assignment as well so I can watch it. Any questions about the 60-second video introduction, which is a new kind of component? And those of you watching the class virtually, feel free to, of course, email me, text me if you need to set up virtual office hours to talk about that. Please let me know. All right, so looks like we're going to end a little early today, but there's one last thing. So what we're going to do for Thursday, or before Thursday, is I want you guys to draw your own 19th century city. For those of you joining us in the face-to-face class today, there's handouts on the end of the tables there. You can take one home with you. For those of you participating in the class virtually, if you go back to Learn where we just were, on today's lecture, you'll see the same PDF handout that you can either download and draw on, or if you're into computer graphics, draw on the computer and send it to me. But essentially what I want you to do is that here in the classroom, we're actually going to start building our own American city on paper on the wall here in the classroom. And so what I want you guys to do is use the grid paper that I've provided you. And what you will need to do is you will need to start drawing your own 19th century city. And so what are you going to need? Well, the squares that you'll see on the paper represent 10 feet by 10 feet. And so using this grid pattern, you're going to need some roads and railroads. Again, 19th century cities was all about the rapid rise of urbanization, the rapid rise of industrial factories, the rapid rise of consumerism and consumer shopping. Not so much green space, because we were more interested in cramming people in the land, but there was green space. Let's not be dismissive of it. So you're going to need all of these things to support these people. Back then, of course, people are walking. So where are you going to put your factory in relation to the residential, in relation to the consumer shopping opportunities? So you kind of need to think about where you're going to organize these things, right? So let's think here. The goal of the 19th century planning city was to respond to the rapid population growth, housing close to jobs and shopping. And while there was certainly a need, and it did exist, for civic space, recreation, city parks, public safety, et cetera, these are on the low end of the spectrum. So if you do add those things in there, if at all, it should be a very small amount of space. So what's going to happen is those of you joining us face-to-face in class, bring those into class colored out, and we will actually pin those up on the wall on Thursday. Those of you participating in the class virtually, go ahead and draw this out, color it in, take a picture of it, and email it to me, or scan it and email it to me, and I will print it out, and I will bring that into class, and I will pin it up on the wall for you. And so on Thursday, what will happen is we'll actually start designing an American city on the wall in the classroom. So those of you guys joining us face-to-face, you guys will give me a hand when we'll start putting those up, and then we'll incorporate the things that we'll be doing from class on Thursday as well. Any questions about that one? All righty, so that's all I have for today, guys. Thank you very much for participating in class today. I really appreciate it. Those of you watching the class virtually, thanks for hanging in there, and we'll see you next time.